I found out that my husband was cheating on me with my own sister, through a baby monitor. If someone had told me this story before, I would have thought it was a ridiculous plot from a cheap soap opera. But it happened to me. That day, everything felt completely ordinary. I went to the neighbors for coffee, just 2 houses away. I took the baby monitor with me because my daughter was napping, and I'm one of those anxious moms who checks her baby's breathing 10 times a night. I was sitting in her kitchen, chatting about nothing, holding a mug, half listening to the background noise from the receiver. Usually it's just silence or faint rustling. Then I heard footsteps. I didn't tense up. My husband was home. That was normal. Then I heard a woman's laugh, and something inside me clicked. Because I've known that laugh since childhood. It was my sister's laugh. I didn't just recognize it, I felt it on my skin. I immediately started looking for explanations. Maybe she just dropped by for a minute. Maybe I forgot I invited her. Maybe I was losing my mind. I even checked whether the monitor had picked up someone else's frequency. I twisted the dial, turned it off, turned it back on. The voices didn't disappear. I stood in the middle of my neighbor's kitchen, listening to my sister say my husband's name in a tone you don't use with just anyone. I heard a pause. I heard muffled sounds, not explicit details, but enough to understand everything. I knew that tone. I knew that breathing. My hands started shaking. The coffee mug nearly slipped out. My neighbor was still talking, laughing. I couldn't hear her anymore. I only heard them. In my house, in our bedroom, while my daughter was sleeping in the next room. The first reaction wasn't anger. It was denial. My brain desperately searched for any loophole. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe it was an old video playing somehow. I clung to any absurdity just to avoid accepting the obvious. I left the neighbor's house, barely explaining anything. I walked home quickly but didn't run. It felt like if I ran, it would mean I believed it was real. As long as I walked calmly, there was still a chance it was a mistake. I turned the baby monitor off before I reached the door. I couldn't listen anymore. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I went into the bedroom. The sheet was rumpled. On the floor lay a black hair tie. I recognized it instantly. My sister buys them in bulk. I just sat on the bed and stared at that hair tie. No hysteria. No screaming. It felt like someone had hit me over the head with something heavy. I was looking at someone else's life. A couple of minutes later, my husband came out of the bathroom. He saw me and froze, just for a second. But that 1 second told me everything. He knew something had happened. He started talking, too fast, saying my sister had stopped by briefly, family stuff, that I looked strange. And right then I realized they were going to try to make me look like an idiot. They were going to convince me I'd imagined it all, that I hadn't heard what I heard. My sister was already gone. She'd slipped out the back door like nothing happened. I sat there looking at him, and dozens of small moments started flashing through my mind. Their jokes, the way they looked at each other, how she came over just because far too often, how he always defended her when we argued. I used to think it was normal. We're family after all. The most painful realization wasn't the cheating itself. It was the thought that it might have been going on for a long time, that I might have been the only one who didn't know, that they looked me in the eye across the dinner table and then went into our bedroom. That day I heard enough to make my old life cease to exist. There was no way back. After that day, I decided I wouldn't scream, wouldn't throw a tantrum, wouldn't give them the satisfaction of watching me fall apart. If they were going to try to make me crazy, then at least I'd be crazy with a clear head. That decision marked the beginning of the hardest period of my life, because on the outside, I became calm, while inside I was being torn apart by suspicion, rage, and humiliation I couldn't release anywhere. From the very first evening, my husband chose complete certainty. He spoke evenly, without hesitation, without panic, explained that my sister really had just stopped by briefly, that I'd misunderstood everything, that the bed was messy because he lay down after work, that the hair tie could have been there for days. The calmer he sounded, the more a dangerous worm of doubt started wriggling inside me, whispering that maybe I really had imagined it. Maybe the sounds from the baby monitor weren't what I thought. But every time I let myself doubt my memory, even for a second, I remembered my sister's intonation, the one you can't confuse with anything else. I grew up with that voice. I heard it when she lied to mom, when she flirted in high school, when she tried to get what she wanted. That exact intonation pulled me back to reality and raised another wave of fury inside me. He began subtly hinting that I'd become too nervous, that maybe exhaustion was getting to me, that staying home with a child was hard, that I needed more rest. At one point, I caught myself justifying my feelings, explaining myself, as if I were the one guilty for hearing them through the baby monitor. That feeling of humiliation was almost physical, like someone was slowly erasing me with a rubber. I texted my sister, not with accusations, just a simple question. Why did she come over? She replied too quickly, too smoothly, as if she'd been waiting for the message. Said she stopped by for 5 minutes to discuss family matters, that I was reacting strangely, that maybe I had problems in my marriage. When I read it, I was overwhelmed by how absurd it all was. They were painting me as unstable in the one situation where I was the only person who had heard the truth. Then the game began. They acted almost in sync. My husband suddenly became attentive, brought flowers, offered help, tried to be caring. But behind all that performative gentleness, I could feel irritation whenever I asked too many questions. My sister started texting more often than usual, sending funny videos, inviting us to dinners, behaving as if no abyss had opened between us. That fake normalcy pressed on me harder than any confession ever could. I started checking his phone. Every time I picked it up, I felt shame, because I used to be proud that we had no secrets, no suspicion. Now the phone was clean, messages deleted, call history spotless. Everything looked perfect. And that sterile cleanliness scared me more than anything. It spoke of preparation, of calculation, of me being too late to the game. Sometimes I caught myself thinking maybe I really did imagine it all, that I was tired, that the baby monitor sound was distorted, that my brain filled in the details. Those thoughts terrified me more than the affair itself, because if I couldn't trust my own memory, I had nothing left to stand on. At family dinners with my parents, I watched them so intently, I could probably have noticed the tiniest eye movement. My sister held my daughter and smiled. My husband joked. My parents laughed. Everything looked perfect. And that very perfection felt like mockery, because I sat among them feeling like a stranger in my own family. I asked detailed questions about that day, times, reasons for the visit, and their answers matched too precisely, as if they had rehearsed every detail beforehand. That gave me the feeling I wasn't just betrayed. I was betrayed deliberately, coldly, without a drop of remorse. Over time, my husband stopped pretending to be patient and started showing open irritation. Said he was tired of my suspicions, that I was destroying the family with my fantasies, that if I didn't trust him, that was my problem. At one point, I almost believed that reversed logic, because the constant pressure and his unwavering certainty began to erode my sense of reality. At night, I sat alone replaying that day in my head, trying to reconstruct every second, every sound, every pause, because I was afraid that if my memory failed me, I would have no proof, no inner support, no reason to keep fighting. The most painful thing was still hoping for a confession, hoping one of them would break and tell the truth, that it would end in an honest conversation instead of this slow psychological suffocation. Instead, I got only coldness, synchronized lies, and the realization that I was alone against two people who were excellent at working as a team. And one night, looking at my reflection, I understood I had almost stopped believing myself. The fear of being seen as crazy had become stronger than the fear of being betrayed. That was when I hit bottom, because if I couldn't trust my own ears, my own memory, my own feelings, then I wasn't just losing a husband and a sister, I was losing myself. And that was more terrifying than any betrayal. I reached the point where I had to either fully accept that I was paranoid or find something real to hold on to, because living between I made it all up and the two closest people in my life betrayed me was impossible. That was when help came from the person I least expected, my husband's younger brother. We were never particularly close. He always stayed out of family drama, joked more than he talked seriously. Honestly, I thought he was a bit immature. But that day he messaged me himself and asked if everything was okay. Said the atmosphere at the last family dinner felt so tense even people who didn't know the details could sense it. I wanted to brush it off, say everything was fine. Instead, almost against my will, I asked him directly. Had he noticed anything strange between my husband and my sister? There was a long pause. Even through text, I could feel him hesitating. Then he answered uncertainly, said he hadn't wanted to interfere, thought maybe he was imagining it. But a few times he really had noticed strange looks, overly personal jokes, touches that lasted a little too long. Once he walked in unannounced and saw them quickly move to separate rooms. When I read that, something clicked inside me again, but differently this time, not shock, confirmation. As if someone finally turned on the light in a room where I'd been trying to make out shapes in the dark. I realized I wasn't crazy. I hadn't invented it. My feelings had a basis. He said he didn't want to destroy the family, hoped it was just awkwardness or his imagination. But seeing how tense I was, he decided it was better to tell the truth than stay silent. That moment brought not relief, but a strange mix of anger and clarity. Now I had not only the recording in my head, I had a witness, even if indirect. I started remembering everything again, this time without trying to excuse them. I remembered how my sister suddenly started coming over more often exactly on the days my husband worked from home. How they sometimes went quiet when I entered the room. How he abruptly changed the subject once, when I asked what they were texting about so long in the group chat. Before, I brushed those details aside, because I didn't want to be the jealous wife or the suspicious sister. Now every little piece fell into place. I checked old bank statements and found several small, strange transactions that seemed meaningless at first glance. But they matched the dates when my sister happened to be around. Joint lunches, purchases that weren't for the house. These weren't just feelings anymore. They were facts, indirect, but real. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I simply said I was no longer participating in this performance, that I was filing for divorce, that I had already spoken to a lawyer, that financial matters would be handled formally, and most importantly, I would no longer allow anyone to make me feel crazy. Because that had been the most painful part of the whole story, not the cheating itself, but the attempt to erase my reality. I didn't yell, I didn't accuse. I simply said I was no longer participating in this performance, that I was filing for divorce, that I had already spoken to a lawyer, that financial matters would be handled formally, and most importantly, I would no longer allow anyone to make me feel crazy, because that had been the most painful part of the whole story, not the cheating itself, but the attempt to erase my reality. My sister tried at first to talk about a misunderstanding, that the recording could be interpreted differently, but her voice trembled. For the first time I saw fear in her eyes instead of confidence. My husband stayed silent the longest. Then he started saying I had ruined everything, that I could have handled it more quietly, that I humiliated him in front of the family. And in that moment I understood how deeply convinced he was that the problem wasn't his actions, but the fact that I stopped being silent. It hurt to look at my parents, at their confusion, at how not only my marriage but the entire family structure was collapsing. But along with the pain came a strange relief. I was no longer alone with my truth. I no longer had to doubt myself and replay that day in my head. Now everything had been said out loud. I didn't feel like a winner. I felt like a person who had finally stopped enduring. And when I walked out of that house, I understood there was no going back. Divorce was inevitable. My relationship with my sister was most likely over forever. But along with that, I felt I was taking back control of my own life. No one would ever again convince me that my feelings were the problem instead of a reaction to betrayal. It was an all-or-nothing decision, and I chose all for myself, even if it meant losing the family as it had been. Because staying in that story meant slowly disappearing, and I was done disappearing for someone else's convenience. The divorce went faster than I expected, and at the same time, slower than I wanted. Legally, everything can be finalized in months, but inside yourself you keep divorcing long after the papers are signed. At some point, I realized I was formally free, but emotionally, I was still carrying the weight of that recording, that dinner, those looks that changed my family forever. At first, he tried playing remorse, then victim, then the man who made a mistake. But every time, his words carried the same thing: regret for the consequences, not for the act itself. That finally killed any lingering doubt in me. I no longer saw in him someone I could build anything honest with. I saw someone upset that he had been caught. My sister disappeared at first. Then she sent a long message saying, feelings can't be chosen, that she never wanted to hurt me, that everything got out of control. I read it and understood that betrayal rarely looks like villainy. More often, it looks like ego wrapped in beautiful excuses. In that moment, I finally decided I didn't have to understand her motives to allow myself to have nothing more to do with her. But honestly, inside me there was still anger. Not the loud kind that demands a scandal, but a quiet, sticky kind that wakes you up at night and reminds you that two of the closest people humiliated you. For a long time, I wondered what to do with it, because simply walking away didn't feel like enough. I wanted to put a period on it in a way they would remember, and here I probably didn't act perfectly, but I acted honestly. I decided that if they loved playing secret games so much, I would play open. So I sent the recording not only to my parents, who had already heard it at dinner, but also to a few mutual acquaintances. Quietly, without comments, without insults, just the file that spoke for itself. Sometimes silence says more than any accusation. It may have been petty, some might say it was beneath me, but at that moment it was important for me to restore balance. For too long I had been the only one feeling shame while they lived comfortably in their version of reality. When the truth stopped being my private burden, I felt lightness for the first time in a long time, even if it carried a bitter aftertaste. The most absurd part of the story is that a few months later they tried to be together officially. But the great love they destroyed a family for couldn't withstand the pressure of reality. When a relationship begins with deception, suspicion always lives inside it. I heard from mutual friends that now he checks her phone, and she throws jealousy scenes. Sometimes I catch myself feeling an almost indecent satisfaction from that irony. I didn't take loud revenge. I didn't make public scandals. I didn't ruin their careers or write furious posts full of accusations. I simply let the truth come out, and I walked away, taking my self-respect with me. And perhaps that is the most sophisticated form of revenge, not destroying them, but allowing them to live with the consequences of their own choices. Things with my daughter are more complicated. She will grow up in a story where mom and dad are no longer together, where her aunt no longer comes to holidays. I often think about how to explain it to her so she doesn't grow up believing love always ends in betrayal. Because I don't want to pass my fear on to her. I want to pass on the ability to walk away when she isn't respected. Sometimes I ask myself whether it was worth doing everything so openly, worth sending the recording, worth destroying the illusion completely. And every time I come to the same answer, if I found myself in that kitchen holding the baby monitor again, I still wouldn't be able to pretend I heard nothing. Because the most terrifying thing in betrayal isn't the act itself. It's the attempt to make you doubt your own reality. Now my life is quieter, simpler, and more honest. There are fewer people in it, but more clarity. I didn't become a perfect, strong heroine from an inspiring story. I simply became a woman who one day heard enough to stop enduring. And if there is a moral in this story, perhaps it's this. Sometimes destroying a family isn't a crime. Sometimes it's the only way to save yourself. To this day, I still don't know what hurts more, the cheating or the attempt to pass it off as my imagination. But I know one thing for sure. If my daughter ever finds herself in a similar situation, I want her to choose herself faster than I did.